I do not remember how I made first contact with Ernst Simmel. My suspicion is that he made the first move, directly or indirectly. I know that other people were interested in getting me into analysis. It was probably Simmel's political sympathies and his relation to my father which prompted me to start with him. My father had been the leading representative of the social democratic physicians, while Simmel represented the independent socialistic physicians who were somewhat more radical. Simmel put me on the couch without any introduction, preliminaries, or explanation. He simply said, "You know the rules, so why don't you follow them?" These were to be the last words that I heard from him for a long time to come. I did the best I could and catapulted myself into a wild, free associative confusion, in which he left me alone for some hours. Either he did not listen or did not care, or so I felt. I also suspected him of waiting for some revelation concerning my father's attitude towards him. My first dream was about a little ferocious dog which my father used to call the Jewish lion. This creature used to bark at everybody loudly, but impressed nobody. Naturally, my association from the little dog to Simmel, who was unusually short and had already white hair, this association seems to have antagonized him, or so I felt. In any case, he finally interrupted me in an almost brutal way with an ironic question. "Do you call this free associations?" That remark stopped me, and I became careful. I blamed my analyst for my resistance. Frequently, I opened my sessions with hostile remarks about my colleagues at the hospital. He related this to himself, which I found ridiculous. Only now do I see how right he was. In any case, I became even more careful. I had no wish to start another all-out fight with a new father figure. I dreaded the fights in my childhood, which had severely traumatized me. I realized only much later that I needed these fights and loved them. In other words, I started early to develop a sadomasochistic relationship to my father. I transferred such relationship to Simmel, using my previous experience very carefully and with skill. I do not believe that he saw through that defensive maneuver. I certainly didn't. I had no wish to start another all-out fight with a new father figure. I dreaded the fights in my childhood, which had severely traumatized me. I realized only much later that I needed these fights and loved them. In other words, I started early to develop a sadomasochistic relationship to my father. I transferred such relationship to Simmel, using my previous experience carefully and with skill. I do not believe that he saw through that defensive maneuver. I certainly did not. I remember Simmel's waiting room more clearly than his consultation room where I spent so many hours. There was a big, massive oak table, designed by Martin Freud. On it was only one book containing pictures of Charlie Chaplin. I never had a chance to look at all those pictures. It was a habit of Simmel to insist on being paid in cash and not by check, which he said was not real money in the unconscious. The possible tax benefit of such arrangement occurred to me only years later, actually only when I wrote these reminiscences. After some months and during an hour with me, he got a telephone call from a friend in the police department at the Alexanderplatz, who warned him that the secret police were on the way to arrest him. He was told to leave town immediately. The message was given in prearranged code with the words, "Bring the baby to the sanitarium immediately." Simmel's telephone had never before interrupted an hour, so he explained the situation to me. I sat up and reached for one of his cigarettes, an unheard-of liberty. Since he assumed that his house was under surveillance, we escaped through the back window from the staircase and climbed down into the backyard, over a fence, and into an alley. This was not an easy accomplishment, since we both were small in stature. From the alley, we went to a sanitarium in West End, where he got some money from Dr. Fritz Mollenhoff. I was sent to another friend, Dr. Hildy Maas, in order to get additional funds from her. Dr. Maas was hesitant, as everybody had become at that time of beginning terror. I also may have looked uncomfortably Gentile to her. Soon, She recognized me, and in spite of all the anxiety and excitement of the hour, I discovered a peculiar and surprising fact, which was totally new to me. When Dr. Moss recognized my name, she realized that she knew me from the analysis of my mother. Dr. Moss assumed that I knew this, and I did not feel that this was the moment for any corrections or questions. She also called me Peter, which was my brother's name. It was he who had played a great part in my mother's analysis, while I seemed to have been neglected in her associations, as in her life. In the excitement of the moment, with a real death threat for Ernst Simmel, I could not correct this mistake, which contributed to the uncanny atmosphere of that day. Dr. Moss, later working in London, never answered my inquiries about these events. I did not see Dr. Moss again, but many years later, I did see her husband, shortly after the Second World War, at an international psychoanalytic meeting in Amsterdam. He stood in front of Rembrandt's Night Watch. When I recognized him and reached out to shake his hand, our hands failed to meet, and I realized that he was blind. He reacted to my moment of startled confusion by saying, "All my life I wanted to see this, my favorite painting, but I never could get here. Now that I am old and blind, I finally made it." This has always been a story of great symbolic meaning for me. There are occasions when one may as well be blind to see with inner vision what outer vision cannot perceive. From Dr. Moss, I rushed to Simmel's wife, who lived in hiding with her little son, approximately 2 years of age. The child played with a key, his only toy. I was surprised at the youthfulness of the woman to whom I gave the money. This peaceful scene was strangely reminiscent of a scene in my early childhood. I once cut myself with a bread knife, deep between my thumb and left index finger. I tried to hide my hand in the pocket of my pants until the blood soaked through the pants and my father discovered the disaster. I did not dare to confess that I had tried to cut a piece of bread in the kitchen. So I told a story about a key which did not fit the drawer and ripped the skin between my fingers. Nobody believed me. As a child, I felt guilty and unworthy to eat the bread of my father, from whom I felt threatened and whom I hated and loved. By helping Simmel, I helped the new father to get away, in defeat, with me sadly triumphant. I would have to suffer for it. At that time, I had just received 500 marks for the publication rights for a manuscript I found in my father's literary estate and which I had edited. I remember how I got this money from the bank, and for some reason, they had to give it to me in silver. In a symbolic way, these coins reminded me of the 30 pieces of silver given to Judas for betraying Jesus. I put the silver in an old tobacco pouch and gave it to Simmel. When I told Atelka in the evening what I had done, she asked shyly, "Did you have to give him all of our savings?" I was speechless about such callousness. Only after my analysis did I realize that my generosity certainly had ambivalent motives. I loved Simmel and still was happy to help him get away. For once, I had a chance to not just wish him away, but to actually help to pave the way for him. Simmel disappeared for some months, or only weeks, but then came back to everyone's surprise. He did not yet believe that anybody could seriously threaten him, an old soldier of the First World War, decorated with the Iron Cross. He hesitated to move voluntarily and waited for the axe to fall. He saw me a few more times and made the disarming remark, "We have broken every rule and regulation of analytic training. I should be put into an analytic concentration camp." I remember how I talked about the recent death of my father who died in my arms. After his death and during this first part of my analysis, I suffered from a severe spastic colon. Simmel interrupted my story and asked, "What comes to your mind?" I immediately saw before me the praying hands of Albrecht Dürer. Simmer did not accept this association as genuine and proceeded to give an interpretation of the spastic colon. The hands were not supposed to be praying, but forming a balled fist. The spastic colon, as he explained, leads back to shaking the fist at an enemy. but getting afraid and hiding the threatening fist in the pants pocket, where I had once hidden my bleeding hand. By then, the symbol was converted into a spasm. I also consulted Sanitätsstritt Professor Dr. Ferdinand Saarbrück. He had been a bitter enemy of my father in previous times, but over the years he had slowly turned to find him a grudgingly respected colleague, and a good collegial relationship had developed. I also consulted Sanitätsstritt Professor Dr. Ferdinand Saarbrück. He had been a bitter enemy of my father in previous times, but over the years he had slowly turned to find in him a grudgingly respected colleague, and a good collegial relationship had developed. Saarbrück, knowing my father's recent death, said that these spasms are not appendicitis, but are caused by identification with the dead father. "You can't believe, Herr Kollege," he told me, "how many operations are performed on members of a family recently bereaved by death." I was quite impressed by the psychological insight of this so unpsychological surgeon. My association of the praying hands did not contradict Simmel's interpretation, but confirmed it. The praying hands symbolize the plea to forgive the wish to attack. They are a gesture of praying for mercy, forgiveness, and love. I remember distinctly that the interpretation had no influence on the painful symptom. The spastic colon disappeared approximately 15 years later, in 1946, when I felt I had atoned for my sins through the years of service in the American Army. Another time, I felt uncomfortable with my belt. Simmel asked innocently why I did not loosen it. I felt horrified at the idea, uncovering the hidden meaning of the homosexual surrender and its defenses against it. To surrender to my father, or his representative Simmel, meant certain death in my unconscious. Feelings of love and tenderness are not allowed to German sons. They are destined to become fighters, not lovers. I am not sure whether I understood the incident at that time, or later, after my analysis, or now, when I write about it. The fact remains that this seemingly insignificant detail remained so clearly in my mind throughout so many years. When it finally became clear to Simmel that he would have to leave the country, he made two suggestions. At first, to go through all my dreams with him, because it would be easy now to understand them, and we would be able to read them like a book. We never got to do that. In the second place, he advised me to continue my analysis with Teresa Benedict, who had just moved to Berlin from Leipzig. I remember distinctly, in contrast to my opinion now, that I felt utterly misunderstood by my analyst who could make such a preposterous suggestion. How could he send me to a woman? Knowing all the horrible things I had told him about my mother, he should have known that I would never be able to trust or to confide in any woman. So I maneuvered my wife into analysis with Teresa Benedict, while I referred myself to Felix Bohm. Simmel's immigration to the United States in 1934 terminated my analysis, and I did not see him for many years until we finally met at an analytic congress in Chicago. In 1946, he invited me by letter to come to Los Angeles. I followed the invitation for a visit, which I spent as a guest in Simmel's house. A few months later, still in the same year, I settled permanently as a training analyst with the Los Angeles Psychoanalytic Institute and Society. I was unanimously elected as training and supervisory analyst by all analysts involved in training. 5 years later, some of us founded a new institute called the Southern California Psychoanalytic Institute and Society. I had learned in trying to deal with my father, with my teachers in the university, and with my analysts, how to disarm them with my charm. Perhaps it is not possible to analyze charm, and I changed it later, I suppose under the influence of my patients. By now, charm has changed to honesty. My ambivalence is much less intensive than it was. A part of the final work was done in relationship to my son, who grew up from a rebellious rival to a tender, loving man. I thought if he could allow himself that, so could I. I was fond of Simmel and would have liked to work with him. This was not possible. Now, almost 40 years after I saw him the last time before he died, I recognize his ambivalence towards me, the younger man. I do not believe that our inability to work together was due to an unresolved negative transference on my part. He, too, did not want me as a friend or a colleague, but as an obedient son. That I was no more. When I tried to work with him at the Los Angeles Psychoanalytic Institute, he impressed me as an irritable, suspicious, dictatorial little man. His severe coronary insufficiency and his painful angina attacks made any kind of discussion impossible, since he reacted to the slightest difference of opinion with angina attacks. I was friendly and offered the German du. He was the only man with whom I talked German in America. He died within a year after my arrival in Los Angeles of a final, massive coronary attack. I remember him as an old man, but actually, he was only 65 years old when he died, 1947. I was 43. His most destructive trends were expressed in the idea he had about the organization of psychoanalysis in California. He had the ambition to become a kind of analytic czar with dictatorial power. Whatever else was given as theoretical or technical reasons for the split of the two analytic societies in California is unimportant, compared with the rebellion of the younger men against the attempt of dictatorship by the older generation. Some analysts wanted us, the founders of the Southern California Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, to be marked as Alexander's boys. Such an identification was easy and impressive, but wrong and misleading. Theoretical and technical differences about psychoanalysis between the founders of both societies were never formulated and remained far in the background. The real differences and difficulties were personal in nature. Ernst Simmel and the old guard of the Los Angeles analysts had a hierarchical idea about the structure of the psychoanalytic movement. Simmel hoped psychoanalysis could be administered by him single-handedly. He wanted to be sure that some of us, who came to Los Angeles after years of service in the armed forces, were still faithful to his way of analytic thinking. We at that time did not feel like discussing the basis and the meaning of psychoanalysis. Undergoing a kind of check and re-examination whether we were still analysts in the eyes of Ernst Simmel was totally unacceptable to us. After the war years, we got tired of talking about work and anxious to go to work and make a living. So we had to proceed without him. The founders of the Southern California Psychoanalytic Society and Institute demanded the right, the unrestricted right, to think Freudian, but to think for ourselves. Without this freedom, I could not have worked. I had previous experience how an encroachment of this freedom makes the life of a psychoanalyst miserable and his work impossible. Looking back at my analysis with Simmel in Berlin, I am surprised how little I remember with the content of so many hours. What had we been talking about? I am furthermore struck by the enormous resistance which I had to overcome in order to undergo analysis. This did not especially bother me at the start. Every day, I spent almost 3 hours on the train from the opposite side of Berlin to Simmel's apartment office. My only luxury was to travel second class instead of third. There was no first. The most decisive aspects of my Oedipus complex were transferred to Simmel, and due to the catastrophic events of that time, could not be analyzed, but acted out in a dramatic rescue which symbolized his defeat and my sad triumph. As I saw my father die, I saw Simmel dethroned in America 16 years later, in 1947. Finally, I saw Simmel die. I survived. I was the victor, but the victory was sad. My triumph was a mourning for the losses of a father and an analyst. Something else became clear to me many years later. Actually, when I began to write these memoirs, which seemed to grow into a kind of last chapter of my self-analysis. Through my entire life, I was preoccupied with death. I was not unduly worried about it. I only can say I was always aware of it, especially my dreams in later years show this preoccupation in many various symbols. This is a late concern of my guilt. I saw my father die. I gave the orders as one of his physicians in charge to stop all medication but sedation. I saw my analyst die. First, Ernst Simmel, and then a few years later, Felix Bohm, my second analyst. I am the survivor, and I had to learn how to deal with my guilt. My analysis with Simmel laid the groundwork for my lifelong introspection and continuous self-analysis. The Oedipus transference, to the best of my recollection, was never interpreted, neither in its positive nor in its negative aspects. It was more or less untouched. The analysis could not be finished since the fateful inroad of historical reality interfered with anything reminiscent of the analytic procedure. I could not help that I felt like the savior, and, to much smaller extent, the executioner, of my analyst, like I had previously similar feelings when I became a friend to my father and one of his physicians in his terminal illness. There is, however, great credit due to Simmel. I learned from him the courage to free associate, which became of central importance for all my later life. There are people who have called themselves proudly self-invented, and others have referred to themselves as self-created, even totally self-created, as, for instance, Truman Capote, a variation of the term self-made man. I am a self-found man, found through a lifelong analytic process, starting with my encounter with Simmel.